We will begin by thanking our guests of honor and our mentors. So thank you, Mr. Pabrai, for the lessons we learned in Omaha, Circle of Competence and Cloning is Good, and of course, lessons on Blackjack. Mr. Damani, for being our guide and a well-wisher, and of course, our mentors, Mr. Dhanuka and Mr. Bhavania. Thank you, sirs. Without you, we wouldn't have had the confidence to face these challenging times. Let us all give it up for them. But please be on mute. Turning homemakers and into investors and entrepreneurs requires passion and commitment. And our mentors have persevered through the last 27 years with these two qualities to transform our lives. Mr. Pabrai, you mentioned that the best charities should have a balance between heart and head. And thanks to our mentors, Mentor Dhanuka sir, for having maintained this balance. We have been able to support the underprivileged in the interiors of Bengal in these trying times. And I want to salute on this platform the ma'ams and the real soldiers who have selflessly and efficiently taken charge of distributing essential supplies to the very remote corners of Bengal like Nadia and the Sundarbans. Special mention here, I would like to mention Pooja and Srila. And I would request all of you to please go through the experience, and I would like to express my gratitude to everyone involved in this mission. Swati, increase the screen. Yeah.
For me,
Swati, share. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Yeah. So this was a gesture to say a big thank you to everyone involved in this mission. And coming back to the session, I would like to take the privilege of introducing our guests of honor. What do you get when the guests at a forum are ardent patrons of Warren Buffett and have more than 55 years of combined investing experience? I call it an investing masterclass without precedent. While both have their roots in India, they have blossomed in different parts of the world, one in India and the other in the US. Their investing prudence has made them famous worldwide. While one of our guests is a Dhando investor, the other aptly referred to as the Nawab of Dalal Street, who has been the mentor of Big Bull Rakesh Jhunjhunwala. We've had the good fortune of meeting both gentlemen, but today's tete-a-tete is going to be a game changer for us in these challenging times. Mr. Damani has been a guiding force for us and has had a major contribution to the success of our Omaha trip. Blackjack intended. Sir, we have imbibed your lessons on timeless businesses, dealing with disruptions and the power of compounding, and continue to practice them. Mr. Pabrai is an international author and founder of Pabrai Investments. We are fortunate to have learned lessons on the circle of competence and cloning is good from him in Omaha last year. Mr. Pabrai has been really lucky for us as we ran into Charlie Munger at the Marriott Hotel where we were attending Mr. Pabrai's session. The common thread that runs between Mr. Pabrai and Mr. Damani is that both have a background in technology and have very deftly transitioned to investing. Tax loss is the capital markets game. The guru of investing are ready, my dear friends. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started with the conversation. And as we are all impatient and eager to hear and imbibe what they say, we will be taking up the questions after the conversation. So Mr. Damani, Mr. Pabrai, over to you. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Rachana. Manish, what I thought we should do is say a few, give a slight introduction, and then we could have a conversation with each other, if that's okay with you, Manish.
Yeah, sounds great.
Right. So why don't you start and just set the stage for what you want to speak, and I'll follow up.
Well, I would just say that I'm always very excited to interact with the Millennium Mams because I think that we even in our charity at Dakshina, we are far more excited when we support a girl than when we support a boy. I think that when we support a girl, I think we have impacts which go well beyond the girl, the whole family, and several generations in terms of a wide range of changes that happen. With the boys also the change happens, but it's a little bit different. It's the same reasons why Grameen Bank went with the women and such. And so I think that as the I would say the foundation of households, it is a huge advantage if the women are financially literate and if the women understand just the basics of investing and compounding. And actually those fundamentals are really simple. I mean, the first thing is spend less than you earn, and that spending less than you earn is squarely in the hands of the women for the most part. And so I think women in households can be the drivers of the savings, which become the cornerstone. And then the second part is that you don't need to take heroic actions or even understand companies or any of those things. I think just consistent long-term investing in broad indices over a long time will deliver great returns. And so that's just the magic of compounding, is that there are three variables, the capital, the length of the runway, and what ends up being the annualized rate of return. And there's an interplay between these three variables. So you don't need a high rate of return if you have a very long runway. So if I were getting 50% a year for 5 years or 5% a year for 50 years, the results become almost interchangeable. And so it's very important to start very early. And even the amount of capital becomes very limited. And there are, if you get a chance today, I'll go through some interesting stories of compounding with the Indians that sold the island of Manhattan to the Dutch, just to show how small sums can become really large sums, even without very high rates of compounding over a period of time. So looking forward to the session.
Great. Thanks, Manish. First of all, thank you, Rachna. Thank you, Vishnuji, and thank you, Vanya-ji, for inviting us today. Very grateful for the invitation. I've, of course, had the privilege of addressing the Millennium Mams in Calcutta, and that has always been a lot of fun. A lot of my wife's friends were in the audience, so I got a lot of chance to poke fun at her at that time, but it was all in good fun. I'd like to start by first, of course, wishing all the Millennium Mams here Happy Mother's Day. In fact, some of you may be grandmothers also, so Happy Mother's Day to all of you. Please enjoy yourself at home with your kids, and we all know that is the most precious part of our being, is our children. So I hope you all have a great Mother's Day. As far as I'm concerned, how has the last 60 days mattered? In some ways I've changed, in some ways I haven't changed. How have I changed? Well, I haven't shaken anyone's hand for the last 60 days. So people think I'm scared of CV-19. That's why I'm not shaking hands. What I'm actually afraid of is that people are running out of toilet paper. So that's why I'm not shaking hands. My wife thinks nothing has changed. She said before the CV-19 lockdown, I was eating, drinking, watching TV and sleeping. Said, after the lockdown, you're doing the same thing. I said, no, I'm now watching TV and sleeping at the same time. So there is a difference between pre-CV-19 and post-CV-19. But levity aside, I just thought I'd speak on some basic questions which all your members would have, just to try and get that out of the way. And then we'll engage Mohnish and me in a conversation back and forth. The first question that I get when I interview other people and I interview other people is, when will we return to normal? I mean, that's the basic question everyone wants to know. When will we return to normal? Unfortunately, the data is not very good. As an aside, I've been reading a lot of people from Buffett who says that this is something he's not experienced, to people like Trump who says that magically this will disappear and things will get better. But the most cogent explanation I found for what's going on and returning to normal is I found in a video, an Oprah Winfrey interview with a Dr. Michael Osterholm. It was done in 2006, and it seems like Dr. Michael was talking yesterday. The clarity of his thought and what was happening, he was expressing in 2006, but it actually happened. It feels like it's happening yesterday. The video is on YouTube, so I would sincerely urge all of you to look at it. His name is Dr. Michael Osterholm. And the typical conclusions that he comes up with, he says that by the time this gets over, it will be 16 to 18 months. So we're barely 3 weeks or 3 months into this pandemic right now. That 60 to 70% of us will be infected, and there'll be serious economic lockdown effects from what's going on. And remember, he said this all in 2006. So I would tend to think that we will see lots of peaks and valleys, spurts and regression in this pandemic crisis. It's not going away very soon. We'll just have to learn to deal with it. And regrettably, I feel that India is probably entering the phase New York was last month, that we're just on the edge of, despite the lockdown being in effect for 4 weeks in all major metropolitan areas, we're just in the verge of, the anecdotal evidence that I get from talking to people is suggesting that hospitals are full and the number count is increasing dramatically. So I think return to normal as we know it, that we go to a stadium to watch a match, we take a plane for a wedding, I think we'll maybe 16 months, 18 months away. The other question I want to address directly is, we always talk that, the GDP is losing trillions of dollars right now. Why is the GDP number that important, and why should we focus on that as individuals? And the best explanation I got from that was by a former US Treasury Secretary called Lawrence Summers. And Lawrence Summers said it's a moral imperative that the emerging markets grow at about 6-7% a year. If they do that, that means they will double the GDP every 10 years. And they double the GDP every 10 years in a generation, which is 20 years, the GDP can grow 4x. So we'll grow from a $2.5 trillion GDP to a $10 trillion GDP within one generation. And that means that the average per capita income, if our population remains stable, will go from $2,000 it is currently to maybe $10,000. And that's the moral imperative. We need to get GDP to grow so that we can pull people out of poverty in India. We cannot accept the status quo that there'll be a rich class and a poor class and we're indifferent to their lives. I think we have a moral responsibility to pull it. And it's very important that GDP growth in India comes back at 6-7%, because without that, the economic inequality, which is being exacerbated by what's happening, is going to be fairly severe. The last point I'd like to invest is how do we invest in this time? And I think Mohnish and I will take this up. But broadly, my view is that if you're busy in your life, you're working as a lawyer, you're working as a doctor, you're working in a shop, and you don't have time for investing, the best way for most of you is probably to do an index investing and do it when markets are low, like they are at the current time. But make sure you're doing it for like 15-20 year period. If you're going to look at that index every 3 months or 6 months to see if you made money or you doing better, you probably are not going to do better. So unless you have a 20-year view, I would suggest that index investing is not good. For the rest of you, if I feel, for example, that there is a second wave coming of coronavirus cases, we might see the market headed lower, headed to the lows it made on March 23rd. So if you are the type who get very nervous when the markets go lower, it's perhaps better to wait it out, with the caveat that in any time in life, if you find something that's very attractively priced, you think the risk is all in the price, you should by all means go and buy it even today. But generally my feeling is that the market is a bit disconnected from the reality on the ground, and that might be due to liquidity, it might be due to any other reason. But I would be careful about putting all my money to work at this point. The last thing I'd like to do is to shout out to my friend Mohnish, who's joined us. I've had the privilege of visiting his facility at Dakshina in Pune. And I can tell you from first-hand experience that it changed me, because what I saw was the future of the India I want. A democratic India, a secular India, merit-based India, educated India. And one man having such an outsized impact is the philosophy that my friend practices, that you have low risk but high upside. And it's really remarkable. And I would suggest to Rachna that whenever we start traveling again, whenever it becomes normal, I hope you all get a chance to visit the Dakshina Foundation. It's truly extraordinary work that Mohnish is doing. So it's a great honor to be sharing the platform with him today. With that, we'll open it up to...
it would be an honor, sir, to visit.
Yeah, I think you guys will really enjoy it. So we can now start the conversation, Mohnish.
Absolutely.
Great. Shall I ask you the first question?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mohnish, other than Munger and Buffett, who we all know, you admire, I admire, my kids admire, fair enough. Who are your heroes in life? Who do you feel that you've learned from, or you wish your life was more like their lives, and why?
Well, I think that there are many heroes, and you know, Charlie Munger always says that we should not limit our heroes to people who are living, and he always says that the eminent dead have some of the best people who can be our heroes are the eminent dead. And even for me, that even though I have gotten to know Warren and Charlie, and I have a friendship more with Charlie than Warren, I think most of my learning from them has come not from the interaction with them, but just from
Mr. Pabrai, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
no sound. And what about now?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay. All right. So basically, you know, that we have many heroes when we move beyond the living ones. And of course, for all of us, I think our greatest two heroes are our parents. You know, I think those individuals always tower large in our brains. And I think in my case, I got tremendous head start in life from both my parents on a number of fronts. But I think that if one opens up to the eminent dead, and I think if you look at, I would say, the cast of characters who are living, I think that there are so many people that one crosses paths with, and you can learn and take things from many people. I mean, I remember, like, one of my good friends is in the UK. His name is Nick Sleep, and some of you may have heard of him. And Nick Sleep, he used to run, I think, north of $1 billion, and the portfolio just had 3 stocks. He just owned Amazon, Berkshire, and Costco. And he's owned those three stocks forever, more than 10 years or so. So a few years back, he wrote to his investors and he said, look, I am going to return all your capital because these are the three stocks I own. 10 years from now, these will be the three stocks I own. And every year you're paying me ridiculous fees. And this is not the way I want to live my life. So please take the money I'm sending you back, buy these three stocks, and you don't need to pay anyone. And I don't want to, be coming into the office or dealing with anything to do with the investment business. So I've never heard of, other than Warren Buffett shutting down his partnership, Nick Sleep actually just shut down things. Warren shut it down because he thought prices were too high. Nick and his partner gave up what would have been probably hundreds of millions of dollars of future income. And then he went on to write A Bicycle Across China and a bunch of different things that he did. So, and I was just thinking, now we're in the time of Corona. Those three stocks are Corona proof. Okay. I mean, nothing's happened to Amazon. Costco is booming and Berkshire is sitting on a big cash pile and they're in great shape. So even though Nick may not have planned for a pandemic, it's interesting that his three stock portfolio just suddenly hits a pandemic and there's no impact. It's amazing. And so, we can learn from all kinds of places. And there's a lot to learn from people like Nick Sleep, not just about investing, but about life. So I think you just pick up different things from different people, and that works out just fine.
Thanks, Manish. Let me share with you some of the...
You're mute.
I'm on mute?
No,
I can't hear you.
We can hear.
You can hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now, Manish?
Hang on. Let me just see if my audio...
Yeah, you have to, I think, increase your volume.
It's clear, no?
Yeah. Is it audible, Mr. Pabrai?
Hello?
I'm trying to see how I can check my audio. I knew how to do that, but I'm just trying to see.
Because we can hear you. We can hear you.
Let me come back to the meeting, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me share with you,
Yes, sir.
just to go ahead. Manish talked about, other than Buffett and Munger, which of course have been my heroes too, and for a long time in the stock market, used to have people like Jim Rogers, all of them who I studied and, sometimes I've met, I've worked very closely with them sometimes.
Yes.
But as I've aged, as I've crossed 60, you want to do different things in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think things people have done that have had a great impact, either had a great impact or lived a second life. And 2-3 names that really stood out to me from what I admire. One, of course, is lately what Bill Gates has been doing.
Yes.
I mean, he was ahead of the pandemic that was happening 4 or 5 years before it actually hit us.
Mm-hmm.
And even today, he's pouring billions of his personal money into vaccine, not knowing whether it will be curable or not in that factory. Plus, he's lived what I always admired, a second life. He's built the greatest technology company in the world. Even today, it's a $1 trillion market cap. At one point, he just woke up one morning, gave the keys to an immigrant from India, Satya Nadella, and said, hey, you guys run it. I don't want to run it anymore. Think about that. Think about rebuilding a $1 trillion company and then handing the keys over to some immigrant and saying, hey, you run it. I want to do something else in life. And so there's a deep desire, I think, within all of us to do something else, to have a second act in life. So I think I really started admiring him. And if I were to be bold enough to guess, I think when this settles down, he's probably going to win the Nobel Prize for the work he's done in global health and particularly with the pandemic. So he's someone I've started admiring a lot. If you read his biography, he's such a hard-strung businessman. But today he's the greatest philanthropist that the world has known. So that would be one. The other one is also very close to where Manish stays. There's a guy you may have heard of. He's much younger than me, but I truly admire the work he's done. He's called Sal Khan of Khan Academy. And what he does is he put tutorials on math, English, history on the net, free to use, so everyone can access it. Suddenly he's democratizing knowledge. And it's become huge. It started with tutoring his cousins. Now there's 60 million people who use it. Bill Gates talks about fondly. And I wish I had that idea. It's such a great idea that he came up with, such beautiful execution. He did it not because he wanted to make money. He did it because he wanted to give back to society. And that small amount of giving back has made such a huge impact with so many kids in emerging markets that I think as we age, as we get to that 60, 65, we all want to think of what our impact in life will be. Is it going to be only monetary, only in financial markets? Or is there some deeper calling? And I hope I can find my deeper calling. But these are the people who have inspired me in the last few years.
Absolutely. I think Mr. Pabrai is there.
Manish?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so actually just on Sal, we recently did, I think about a year ago, we did a MOU and a joint venture with Khan Academy, where we're experimenting with something we call Dakshina 2.0. So we started to work with some government schools in India where we are seeing if the math teachers, if they didn't have math teachers, and Khan Academy has a set of offerings which are designed for the classroom.
Right.
There are a super set of the videos that they have. And so we are leveraging those, and those have a lot of tools built in for testing and tracking the progress of each child. And we've been now working for close to a year. And so it's phenomenal because they have about a 30% team in India, and we get some great support and help from them. And it'll take us a few years to get the data we're looking for, but I'm quite excited about that.
Great. Thanks, Manish. Manish, of course, we can't have a conversation without bringing in Buffett and Munger and talking a little bit about them, as you can imagine. Give me something off the wall that you learned from Buffett or Munger.
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons that came out was ones that just came out at the Berkshire annual meeting. I think most people would have been surprised that Warren did not go shopping. He always complained that he had all this cash and he had no place to put the money. The data that he gave at the meeting, he actually even suggested during the meeting that Berkshire doesn't have much money. He says, when you look at the range of outcomes, the cushion or the cash cushion they're sitting on is not that high. I've never heard him say that before. And the other thing was that I think what Munger mentioned was that they're like a ship captain in a tempest, the worst tempest you ever saw. And he says, our objective is to get to the other side safe and sound, not to go and focus on buying a bunch of businesses. So I think they mentioned that they're open to doing deals that make sense. But it was interesting to see that they've actually been net sellers of equities in the last 4 months, completely out of the airlines, which I think that was a no-brainer kind of decision to make there. Mm-hmm. But I think the second thing is there's a big disconnect between what markets have done so far, even though I don't, overdose on what markets do, and what is happening in the real world. If you look at it from the US perspective, we've had more than 33 million people file for unemployment. It's more than 20% of the workforce. It does not include all the Uber drivers and all the gig economy workers and all that. So the real damage is even higher than that. At the peak of the Great Depression, we hit 25% unemployment. We may go past that peak here, which is quite stunning. And the stock market has just brushed it off. And Warren talked about it at the meeting where he said that, not the crash of 1929 is not really the crash of 1929 because the markets went down a bit, they came back up, and then people thought, okay, we're done. And that's when the real decline came over the next 2 years when it dropped another 85%. So to me, I think that there's a big disconnect between what is happening in the real world and what is happening in the equity markets. And I think the only conclusion I can draw from there is it's not a bad idea to build cash. Even if one ends up, even if none of these gloom and doom scenarios kind of play out, one can start putting it to work a year and a half from now and such. But I think that the recovery from what we are seeing happen in the world will take a long time. So, most of you probably know this, but most businesses are extremely fragile creations. They have learned to survive with very brutal competitive forces acting on them, and they are barely able to survive. They make a few percentage points of profit in normal times. Bill Gates used to say when he first started Microsoft that he wanted the company to have enough cash so it could go for 2 years without getting paid. That he could pay his staff for 2 years if Microsoft never got any revenue. Most businesses cannot pay their staff for even 30 or 45 days if there's no revenue. So most businesses cannot survive for even a few weeks. And so what we are seeing going on in the real economy with small businesses across the board is a lot. It's huge and not accounting for. So I think caution is a good way to approach this.
I'll just follow up with the question, Manish, for you, because I want you to introduce him to our audience. Munga's CIO, if you will, is a guy called Lilu right now. Talk a little bit about him. I know you know him. Why does Munga like him so much? And do you have a contemporary view of what he thinks of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, Lilu and I have been friends for many years. I think I first met Lilu. I think it was 11 years ago, and Charlie introduced the two of us, and he actually he forced us. He said, "I don't really care whether you really like each other or not, but I want you guys to meet at least once a month for lunch." And so what we used to do is we did that. We basically used to get together and meet, and I got to know him quite well over the years. I think Lilu has had I mean, this would become a long topic to go through, but on this call. But I think he's had a very unusual childhood, a very difficult childhood. He was one of the most wanted men in China because he was one of the leaders of Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese government basically wanted to put him away for good. And some people in Hong Kong helped smuggle him out of China, and then they got him to Columbia. And he actually did 3 degrees at Columbia simultaneously. He did an undergraduate degree, and he did an MBA, and he did a law degree. And he finished all 3 degrees in 4 years. And that's kind of unprecedented at Columbia. No one's ever done that before or since. The thing is, he was on student loans at Columbia, and so they used to give him the money kind of ahead of, maybe 3-4 months ahead of when he had to pay his rent and other things. And he used the, in effect, student loan float and invested that. And by the time he finished at Columbia, he had made $1 million on the float.
Really?
So he was a millionaire.
Wow.
So he was a millionaire. Basically, he was like, they would give him $20,000-$30,000
Mm-hmm.
for the semester, and then he'd start investing that, and it would be 70,000-80,000 by the time he actually had to give the money and so on. And so he did really well as an investor. He used to be mainly a venture capital investor doing early stage businesses and such, and then he later switched. But he's, I would say, Lilu is very much kind of a Swiss Army knife kind of investor. He likes to get to know the companies well. He tends to hold them for a very long time. He has a very rich understanding of these businesses, and I've had some amazing conversations with him. I don't know how much of it he wants me to put on the public domain, but I would say that he's got very unusual wiring. And both Buffett and Munger, one of the big things they bring to the investing game is they're really good at focusing on the downside. They immediately hone in on what can go wrong rather than what can go right. And they're able to put a lot of things away very quickly. And Lilu is quite similar. He's very, very focused on what can go wrong, but he's also very good at identifying long runways, getting to know the entrepreneurs and the business leaders. And then, he has some companies in his portfolio that have been with him. He's had them for 15, 20 years in the portfolio. So, unusual wiring, wonderful guy.
Manish, what is his current view on the market? If you can share something, what does he feel about this?
I think that his perspective is similar to what I outlined, where I think that we have a lot of unknowns here. The one thing about this crisis is, unlike other crises that we've had, is there is a definitive end date, almost for sure, a definitive end date when we can not have a fear of catching the virus and such. And that definitive end date, maybe it's 18 months away, maybe it's 15 months away. We'll have to see kind of when that date comes. So that's one thing good about it. But I think that the degree of damage that, and many of the things that can happen with the pandemic are not easy to forecast. The second order, third order effects are not easy to forecast. I mean, like, for example, there are US hospitals that are suffering a lot. They're laying off people because they have no business. They have shut down the elective procedures, and the hospitals make all their money on elective procedures. So one would have thought healthcare is booming, but the 1/5 of the economy in the US, which is healthcare, is having issues. And like CVS was saying that their normal prescription filling rate has gone down a lot. And so there's a lot of concern about like health issues that will prop up because we are kind of deferring a lot of stuff. So we can get unusual effects. So if you look at auto manufacturers, for example, those supply chains are so fine-tuned that the tire shows up 20 minutes before it's put on the car. Those are very finely tuned supply chains. So when you have this type of shutdown takes place, and 3 parts are missing, your line can't move forward. So you will have a lot of impacts of that kind that go on. So I think that, and the other thing about this crisis is that the have-nots are the ones who are really, really impacted. We've seen that in India, but globally, it's the have-nots that were the first to lose the jobs, the have-nots who have the lowest amount of, staying power and, savings and so on. And so the polarization of wealth that we've seen over the decades is going to get exasperated with this crisis. So I think that Lilu would be quite bearish. We already know Buffett and Munger are quite bearish. And what I have learned with these guys is that their intellect is beyond human intellect. So I don't even fully understand all the reasons that why Buffett and Munger are bearish. All I do know is pay attention.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's exactly what the point I wanted to understand from you, because a lot of the smart money that I talk to here also, Manish, are usually bearish. I mean, we've grown 30 years of buying the dips, markets recovering, but a lot of the sense I get from the smart money is that they believe this time it's different, that we will not have a V-shaped recovery. We'll just because the stocks are down 30%, there's no reason to step up and buy those stocks. And the strength of the Nasdaq, for example, year to date, it's showing gains now, is perplexing us. Even though I understand that technology is playing a huge role in people's life, we're just surprised at the speed at which the market has recovered, as opposed to the real economy, which is still in doldrums. I wanted to just share. I think you shared that.
I mean, if we were on a desert island and someone told us all the things that happened in the real economy, and someone asked me to guess where the Sensex is or where the Dow is, I would say more than 50% down. Right. That's what I would have expected. If you take 33 million people out of the workforce, I'd say 50, 60, 70% down. And that's not where we are.
I agree with you. Someone told me that World War II ended on May 7th, 1945, right? Exactly 75 years ago. Someone told me that you don't realize it, but World War III has already started. And the protagonists, antagonists are China and the rest of the world. What do you think about that, Manish?
Well, in the history of the world, there has never been a situation where a power has risen to challenge an incumbent power and everything has been peaceful. That has never happened in the history of the world. So the rise of China is inevitable. And I think on many fronts, we will see significant growth and power increase on the Chinese side. And the United States has been so used to getting its way for so long. I mean, for a while we had the Soviet Union, then that went away. So we've had this unipolar world where the US kind of runs around and does whatever it wants. And it's not used to someone else telling them you can't throw your weight around. And it's throwing its weight around. And right now, US-China relations are probably at a multi-decade low. It's an extremely dysfunctional relationship right now. And it's a very sad situation that we are in that type of situation, because the world is a vastly better place when the United States and China have a lot of cooperation and goodwill towards each other. So we may, we'll have to see. I mean, these are, this kind of like fog of war. It's kind of hard to tell when you're in the middle of these things. But I would say that China is clearly rising. It's less and less interested in being relegated to a secondary role. It's trying to assert itself in a number of different ways. And the US is not used to someone else asserting themselves. And so there's a lot of conflict on a lot of fronts between these two countries. And I hope we can get past the pandemic and we can start resolving these things.
Manish, you talked about there not being a comparable period. But let's go back to World War II, which I started with. In the 1930s, late 1930s, there used to be a saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning everywhere the sun rose, there was a British colony somewhere. And then America became the emerging power of the 20th century. And Britain accepted its role in life as being, second cousin, poor neighbor to America. And that transition was handled pretty peacefully. Do you feel that there was something in history that there can be peaceful transitions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the downside is so extreme for humanity that everyone has a lot of incentives to get there peacefully. But I'm just saying that there, there are inherent issues here which could, I mean, the range of outcomes is wide, and some of the outlier possibilities are ugly, and I hope we don't get there.
I mean, let's just talk about a little bit about this Chinese America problem. From what I understand, 80% of American medicine is made in China. 95% of antibiotics are made in China. I don't know how much of the treasury bill market the Chinese own of America. Maybe 30-40% of the treasury market is owned by China. I mean, can this, is it a political stunt by Trump to paint a villain in order to ensure his re-election? Or is there some deeper festering issues? Because my sense is that this is a battle both will lose. And as the saying goes, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. So all of us who've been trying to get out of the emerging market syndrome will probably lose in this.
The United States has some very valid grievances against China. Trade with China was not fair. China took significant advantage of the United States for a long time. And the United States, to a large extent, allowed that to happen across the world because it benevolently wanted the world to rise. So the US did the Marshall Plan to help Europe get back on its feet. It has given a lot of countries very favorable trade deals, including China, to help them rise up. And the US perspective is that, well, once you have risen enough, then those things need to get revisited, which is what the United States is doing. So I don't see a lot of the trade issues that the US has brought up as being irrational or extreme. But from a Chinese vantage point, they will appear to be irrational and extreme. And so that's where we get the beginnings of conflict. Also, I think what will happen as a result of the pandemic is the United States and many countries around the world are going to redo their medical supply chains. And the United States is not going to have, I would be very surprised if 10 years from now, the United States has the dependency it has on India or China on this level of medical stuff coming from overseas. I think they're going to make sure that there are huge stockpiles in the US. And I think all the world is going to make sure of the stockpiles, but also they're going to make sure about having critical capacity in the US for what is perceived as, core products and services that are required. So I think there'll be a lot of redoing of supply chains, global supply chains along those lines.
Manish, you talked about China and India. A lot of us in India are salivating that India is going to become the new China, the supply base of the world. It seems a bit too optimistic to me. What do you think are the prospects that investment in India will come to make it an alternate supply base to China?
Yeah, so I think India dropped the ball big time. I think right from the time that the United States started increasing the tariffs on China, India had a very wide open playing field to take that business, and it didn't take that business. And if I just contrast India with Vietnam, Vietnam is running out of labor and people with the amount of work that's moved from China to Vietnam. Almost no work has moved from China to India. And the reason it hasn't moved is India is a difficult country for many multinationals to move their supply chains to. And the government, I'm just sorry to say, didn't wake up to this fact and didn't act on this fact. So I think that the red tape, bureaucracy, and all the nuances that are there, which prohibit manufacturing coming to India, it's a very different picture in Vietnam versus India. So Vietnam, a small country, has gained a lot. India has a very favored relationship with the United States. On a personal level, Trump and Modi get along really well. The United States would love to have more of their trade with India, and a lot of the Chinese stuff move over to India. So all the pieces are there, except North Block and Delhi not being where it needs to be.
But would you be encouraged by the recent investment that Facebook and Silver Lake Partners and Vista have made in Reliance? Is that opening the door a little bit to American investments coming in?
I see that as more of a exception. I mean, the big money is in not in these passive investments that you're making inside blue chip Indian businesses. I think the big money is that when you move some small bicycle manufacturer now manufactures all his bicycles in India and sends them to the US. Just those types of things we have not seen happen. And we've seen those move en masse to Vietnam. So I think that I think that we can't really read much into the Saudis or Facebook investing with the Ambanis, because that's an extremely well-run operation. Huge market position, dominant share, a lot of good things about that footprint. But that will not get us to the Holy Grail.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, generally, we've been very hostile to foreign investments, historically speaking. And even in the current contemporary times, whether it was Vodafone in India, or whether it was Walmart in India, we've had ministers come and say,
yeah, we change the rules. They invest in Flipkart, and then we change the rules.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that the core of allowing businesses to come into India and have a very seamless experience. Unfortunately, that is still not there, and it is very sad because it would dramatically increase employment, and we are the incumbent to take it.
Yeah, I agree. But assuming that we cannot replace China or even part of what's in China, what's the India story? I mean, we've long time talked about India's 1 billion population, striving middle class has been the narrative that has driven markets for the last 10 years at least. What is the narrative in the next 10 years? I mean, what moves in India? I mean, how do we become a more prosperous society, according to you?
Well, I think like they say, India grows while the government sleeps at night.
Correct.
And I think that we've had a lot of good things take place in the private sector. So if I look at what has happened with Geo and broadband and internet and 4G, 5G access, those are very critical pieces of infrastructure that enable growth. We need that. So the area the government has to play a major role is to lay the brickwork, lay the infrastructure. So great roads, great highways, great train service and plane service and all that. So we've had the private sector take over a lot of that. Like India's aviation sector is very competitive and robust. India's mobile sector is very robust and doing very well. But I think that some of the other places we fall down. We fall down on physical infrastructure. Places where the government is involved, where the private sector is not so involved, and where the government is not pulling this weight. I mean, if I just look at what China has done with rail, with high-speed rail, and the amount of track they've laid, and if I just compare that to India, I mean, if I looked at India when the British left, in terms of the kilometers of track, then in 1947 versus today, it's a pathetic growth rate. It's hardly changed. And in China, tens of thousands of kilometers of track laid and these bullet trains and all that. That is real infrastructure that has led to real growth. And so I think the role of the government is to enable the growth and make it seamless and then stay in the background. But we have a lot of issues. We have, in Dakshina Valley in Pune, we don't get three-phase power for 4 days a week. India has power plants that are sitting idle. So why would you not have power available all across the country when you have more than enough generating capacity? So we have these kind of backwards policies that lead to these kind of strange outcomes. It's terrible. You cannot have a rapidly industrializing society which is power starved. Just cannot happen.
Cannot happen. But do you feel that this is the price we pay for a democracy, that in fact, the way for an emerging market out is perhaps a benevolent dictatorship, that if you're going to have a democracy, we'll always underperform?
Yeah, Churchill used to say it's the worst system except for all the others. And yeah, I mean, definitely a benevolent dictatorship would be better, but we would be very hard pressed to know in advance whether a dictator is going to be benevolent or not. And the odds are against a dictator being benevolent.
But the odds are also that a communist system blows up, like Russia blew up. I mean, the odds are that the Chinese, while India has a lot of chaos underneath the surface, China has no chaos, but it could blow up. I mean, is that the risk of investing in China?
Yeah, but I would say that the Chinese people have given the Communist Party of China a long rope, and the Communist Party, by and large, has delivered on that long rope. So if you look at the economic growth that has taken place in China, most people in China would agree that would not be possible in a democracy. And so the mandate was given to the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has delivered. And of course, there are a lot of dissatisfaction and rumblings with lack of freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But so far, that society has been willing to pay that price because of the economic development.
Yeah.
We will have to see over time, as economies get prosperous, then at that point, the citizens are looking for more than just economic prosperity. So that whole equation will go through some tension. We'll have to see how that plays out.
But Manish, at least you have the option of investing anywhere in the world that you want. Yet you choose to invest a large percentage of your portfolio in India. Why is that? And can you suggest to us how you've tailored your portfolio based on current events?
So far, my entry into India has not been wise. It has been very unwise. So we haven't so far had a great outcome from the investments we've made in India. I've had far better outcomes with my investments in China, for example, and in the US. But yeah, it also is a kind of point in time. We don't have enough history. I do believe that the investments we have in India, I do believe in the next 5 or 10 years they'll do very well. So India, I think has a number of positives. Very great class of entrepreneurs, good class of business leaders, governance getting better, and because we have such a large growing population, there is pent-up demand on a number of areas. As long as the government is providing the underlying infrastructure, great education, great physical infrastructure and such, the rest of it will follow. But that's a big if. We'll have to see how that works out. I hope it works out. But we have a great demographic dividend. We have a very young country. I also don't think that India will face a big issue from a CV19 perspective, because the average age is 28 and it's super hot. Very few parts of India get really cold. So I think that age is going to help us out a lot, dodge quite a big bullet over here. So I think
I don't know about that, Mohnish. Even 1% of 100 crores is a pretty big number, as you know. So I'm not sure whether the age.
The real CV19 fatality rates, they are starting to believe is in the much less than 1%. So I think they're in the 0.2 or so range. So, and that,
but
that,
given
but that
India's
percentage also is skewed with age. So if you have fewer people who are older, you're generally going to have an overall lower mortality rate. I mean, already, for example, in all the weeks and months that India has exposure, so far the numbers have been quite low.
the operative word is so far,
So
Manish,
far.
at the,
Yeah,
at the
we have to
ground
watch.
level. And my point is that given the poor social distancing, the poor sanitation,
Yeah.
the bad crowded conditions, I mean, I hope you're right. But, you know, as you say, prepare for the worst. I mean, I hope you're right. I hope it doesn't happen. But let me share with you some of my thoughts on where to bet in the markets, and then maybe you can share some of the bets that you made in India for the benefit of our audience. To me, the one thing that seems obvious now in India is that globally is communication. I think companies will be evaluated based on the communication spine. Individuals, I mean, I have a 3-year-old grandson who needs to be connected onto the net to take his classes. So, you know, the first play in India post CV-19 seems to me to be communication. And if you look very hard, there may be 2.1 plays in India in communication. So that's a good sector that, you know, investors can start looking at. Content, of course, is going to be very important. That's much harder to play. But there are a few ways that you can probably play content. Mainstream television, sporting events, people who own the rights to the sporting events. I think that would be a good place to play. I read something, Manish, that startled me today. In the Financial Times, it said that when Wuhan lockdown was going on, the banks were closed, but nobody noticed because they've all moved to digital banking in China. So given all these things, can you tell what your portfolio construct is, and are you going to add or subtract based on some of the things I've said?
Well, I would rather not go there. The reason I'd rather not go there is that I think that it's dangerous, in my opinion, for individual investors to listen to some names and then, you know, go place buy orders or whatever. I just think that it's a fool's game there, because I think the thing with investing is that what makes things difficult is, I mean, yes, we can clearly tell which businesses have great tailwinds and which businesses will do well, but whether the investors in those businesses do well or not is a different question. Because, you know, if a company is, I mean, if I take an example of a company like Amazon, there's no question that Amazon will do very well in the future. But when you start looking at, well, how would an investor in Amazon do when you're buying into $1 trillion market cap, that becomes a more difficult question to answer. And it's not an obvious answer. And, you know, I remember that in late 99, or maybe it was early 2000, there was a very, one of the most senior guys in Indian in Microsoft who had left Microsoft, but he was one of the very first Indians who had worked under Bill, and he actually ran PowerPoint for them, and actually PowerPoint was an acquisition that he ran for them, and then eventually retired. But he had joined Pabrai Funds few months after I started, and he told me, look, if you're ever in Seattle, I can introduce you to some people at Microsoft who might be interested. I said, you know, by coincidence, I'm going to be in Seattle day after tomorrow. And so he said, yeah, come on over. So I went to Seattle and I spent a day where he took me from one office to the other. And a lot of these very early Indians in Microsoft who eventually rose, in some cases all the way to the top, they became investors in Pabrai funds. And at that time, I told them, listen, you guys have 95% of your net worth in Microsoft, and your livelihood comes from the company. And I think you're going to have a terrible outcome holding Microsoft stock from here on out. And Microsoft at that time was a $600 billion market cap, earning less than 10 billion. It was a great business then, just like it's a great business now. But these guys who I was mentioning this to looked at me and said, okay, this is some guy who's trying to get us to give him money to invest and whatever. He has no understanding, because they had never seen a decline in Microsoft stock price ever from the time the company went public to 2000. And from 2000 till almost 2013, 2014, the stock was flat. In fact, it wasn't even flat. It went down more than 50, 60% and then came back. So it was a terrible ride for the next 15 years, even though the company grew a lot in that 15 years. And the money they put in Pabrai funds did a lot better than the money that they kept in Microsoft. So I think that when we look at these businesses, I mean, if I look at, let's say, Reliance, with Jio, and Facebook has invested recently, and Silver Lake has invested, it's hard to find businesses higher quality with more dominant market share than Jio. I mean, incredible business run by superb executors, all of these good things, right? But how an investor does investing today is a very different question than how an investor would have done investing 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So I strongly encourage the Millennium Mams to focus on indexing, dollar cost averaging, and in most of your cases, you've got several decades of runway ahead. And most of your assets are in the future earning power of your families. So that's where the bulk of the wealth sits. And so I think the bigger question here is, or the bigger suggestion here is to increase savings while having a good time. And if you have several decades of runway ahead, then equities are a good place to be, and the index is a good place to be. And actually, the other thing that a lot of Indian families, especially wealthy Indian families, don't take enough advantage of is that the government allows the $250,000 a year to be sent out of India. So getting exposure to the S&P 500 and such is not a bad idea, because then you get exposed to the Amazons and Microsofts of the world as well.
Another way of saying what you said, Manish, is of course, buy with the margin of safety, that not necessarily that a good company is a great investment. So
Yeah.
that's a point I think that people need to understand. Just because the business is good, is it priced into the stock price is what analysts have to figure out all the time. Manish, what we'll do is, Manish, we'll talk a little bit about gold, because as you know, a lot of the Millennium Mams and women all over India are in love with gold. What is your view on gold? What is your view on gold lending? We'll discuss that, and then I think we'll just look at the questions. We have another 15 minutes remaining in our session. So what's your view on gold?
Well, I don't know if you guys have heard, maybe you heard what Buffett's view on gold is. He said that if you put all the gold in the world together in one place, you would get a cube that would be 80 feet on each side. So it would be 80 feet cubed, would be the size of this block of gold. And he said that if you were a Martian looking at planet Earth, you would see these humans digging these holes in the ground, taking out this shiny material, melting it and making it into kind of blocks, then making more holes in the ground where you're building vaults and sticking this metal back in the ground. And they would see this whole activity and wonder what the hell's going on, right? So gold, I mean, from Buffett's perspective, is a non-productive asset. That 80 feet cube does not grow every day. 100 years from now, it's still going to be 80 feet cubed. if I take that money, and I don't recommend you do that, but if you put it into Reliance, Geo,
S&P 500.
etc., okay, or S&P 500, for example, that's growing. That's a growing, because those are productive businesses where
With a
people go to
dividend
work
yield.
every day, they create output. Gold just sits there. So it has value because people give it value. Intrinsically, it doesn't really, it's not a productive asset. So I think my perception has been that the Indian woman has been moving away from gold. I think it used to be forever in India that you put all your money in real estate or in gold, maybe some in FDs, and everything did really well, because real estate never went down and gold always did fine. And
because of inflation. Because of inflation.
The reality is that gold has gone down quite a bit over last several decades, and it hasn't had a straight ride. And real estate has not gone. It used to be more than 20% a year for several decades. That has not been the case. So I think that what I see happening in India is a move towards equity markets. I think that move is going to continue to keep going. But I would say that if you like gold jewelry and you're going to wear it and enjoy it and all of that, you should absolutely buy that and enjoy it. But I don't think you should be investing in gold as a way to invest family assets. I think that's not a good way to go.
Manish, my favorite quote about gold was from Buffett also, where he says, yeah, you can buy gold and you can fondle it, but it won't fondle you back. So something to remember. But one thing that Buffett, and I just wind up with this question, Mohnish, a lot of the new age people that you meet in Silicon Valley, in California, for example, say, yes, gold is a relic of the past. We don't like gold. We don't understand gold. And people will lose confidence in gold at some point. It's only the value because we say it's valued so much. But we do believe in Bitcoins, in the digital alternatives. Do you have a view on that? Do you think the world will move to Bitcoins as a gold standard? Would you invest in Bitcoins?
Well, I should tell you my Bitcoin stories if we have a couple of minutes. So there's a friend of mine who's a venture capitalist in Chicago, and I hadn't, I've known this guy for like maybe 25 years. I used to live in Chicago, and Christmas cards, whatever, we hadn't really kept in touch. And he contacted me a few years back and said, look, I'm coming to Orange County, and I'd love to meet you for coffee, whatever else. And so I said, yeah, sure, Matt, let's meet. And so he came to the office, and I just asked him, so how's it been going? And he says, did you see my profile in Forbes? I said, no. What did you like? What happened? Educate me. Like, I have no idea. So Forbes had apparently profiled these Bitcoin billionaires, and he was one. And he said, Mohnish, based on current Bitcoin prices, my net worth has gone well past $1 billion. And I thought he was just kind of a okay VC, nothing like Sequoia or something. And I said, wow, Matt, that's awesome, man. I said, listen, unload the whole thing, man. Just take the $1 billion and, put an end to the ride. So he said, no, Mohnish, the ride is just getting started. This is going to go to hundreds of billions. And so I said, okay, I told him, listen, I'm the village idiot on Bitcoin. Since you're over here, why don't you educate the village idiot on why, I should be going all in on Bitcoin? And, he's very articulate. We spent a couple of hours, and I did not change my viewpoint that Bitcoin, quite frankly, the value of a Bitcoin, I think you just take it and cash it out. I don't think that long term it has a value. But anyway, so what he said to me was, he said, look, I really want you to understand this universe. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you a Bitcoin. Okay. And then I want you to, open up an account at Coinbase. And he explained all these things to me. So, I said, whatever. So then I was surprised. A couple of days later, he sent me a whole Bitcoin. Okay. And at that point, I think the Bitcoin price was like $4,000 or $5,000. Okay. So I told Matt, I said, I can't take $5,000 from you. He said, no, we had such a good conversation, blah, blah. I want you to have money, blah. So I opened a Coinbase account. I put my one Bitcoin there. And then the next thing when I blinked, it was at like 19,000. So I said, I am out of here. Okay. So I placed my sell order for Bitcoin. And for some reason, they would only sell less than 10,000. So half of Bitcoin sold. Then my account got locked. I couldn't do much. And then recently, I went through a lot of process, got it all done, and I got rid of the second half, I think at 12 or 13,000. And so I got like 15,000 or whatever from the Bitcoin. And that is a good 15,000 for me to use in Vegas whenever it opens up to start a new compounding engine. But that's my view on Bitcoin. I think it's just, it files, put it in the too hard pile or the strange pile or whatever else. And don't go there. What's your take, Ramesh?
I used to share your view, and I used to share the Buffett monger view that it's trash. But after this crisis, I'm not so sure anymore. I mean, I can't believe the Fed will keep printing money, and you will still have faith in the dollar and still have faith in gold. I think people will want something removed from the central bank. So would I put 0.25% of my wealth into a Bitcoin? I might do it because, as you say, there's an asymmetric payoff sometimes in these things. And unlike other assets like dollars or treasury bills, there are only so many Bitcoins that are going to be mined in the world. So as close as I was to the idea, I think even 3 months ago, suddenly after what has happened in the world, I'm not that close anymore.
So I want to give you a Lilu book recommendation.
Please.
We always get these Buffett book recommendations and Munger book recommendations.
Yeah, I'm writing
No one's ever going to give you a Lilu book recommendation.
That's a great gift.
It's only in the Millennium Ma'am's Zoom call where you get such data. Nowhere else. It's exclusive content for Millennium Ma'ams. So
it should be shared with Millennium Ma'am, sir.
Yeah. So Lilu had recommended a book to me, his most recent book recommendation. It's called The Other Half of Macroeconomics. And it's written by a guy named Koo, K-O-O. And, like with a lot of books, I think the guy could have finished the book in 10 pages. A lot of books should be 10 pages long. But then they, go on for 200 pages. But I think that if you read even the first 30, 40 pages of the book, I think it explains, it's the only explanation I've found for why, and it's a very credible explanation for why we did not get inflation when the Fed printed all that money. Because it was always a mystery, right? And even now when the Fed is printing all the money that it's doing right now, which I think is the right thing for it to do, it is unclear to me that we will, even this time around, get inflation. So I think it's a good book to read. We're going to kind of explain a little bit about what's going on. But also, I think one more thing, just since we're on that subject, I think if you think about a family, and I'll give it to you from a US perspective, if a family in the United States has a net worth of, let's say, $1 million, for example, they're worth 7-8 crores. And this whole pandemic hits and all this stuff, and they eat about $50,000 or $70,000 into their savings as they get over this pandemic, that family can easily absorb that shock. And I think if you look at the United States, so if you look at household wealth in the whole world, every man, woman, and child in the whole world, household wealth globally is around $400 trillion. out of that $400 trillion, 100 trillion is in the United States. So the entire household wealth of the 300 odd million humans in the country is about 100 trillion. The GDP of the US is about 22 trillion approximately. And that GDP may go down 30-40% because of this pandemic before it starts coming back. So this family, which is, if you think of the US as one family, the family has 100 trillion. That family can lose 5 trillion or 7 trillion and it won't even feel it. And in fact, this family that has the 100 trillion now, the net worth of this family in 2009 was less than 50 trillion, 55 trillion. So the family has more than doubled its wealth in the last 12 years. So the United States, you know, what it appears to be doing, like it's printing $5 trillion and so on, you have to look at that in the context of the wealth of the country. And it's like a family with $10 million spending $500,000 or $1 million spending $50,000. So I actually have the viewpoint that the US Fed, and Buffett alluded to that, Jerome Powell actually will go down probably as one of the greatest Fed governors because the actions he took are unprecedented. I mean, the Fed has never dealt with anyone other than banks. They, for the first time ever, bought commercial paper directly from issuers. They've never done that ever in their history. So he did a number of things and he's going to continue doing a number of things. But we have to take it in the context of this family worth 100 trillion. If they spend 5 trillion or 7 trillion or even 10 trillion, this family can handle that. And so it should be okay. But you'll enjoy the book.
Great. Thanks for the recommendation. I think we'll take one or two questions from the chat format if we have a few minutes left, Rachna.
Yeah. Maybe one or two questions, sir.
Yeah, we're
Sheila,
almost at the end.
like
So you can look through the chat questions, Manish, and pick your favorite one. And
whatever.
Yeah, I have to figure out how the chat works. Okay, give me a second.
So, someone's already posted the link to Oprah's interview. I think Tanya did that. Thank you. I would strongly urge all of you to watch it. It's actually pretty riveting. Let me take my question.
Sheila, would you like to, yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you ask the question you want? Because there's so many questions here. Why don't you guys, one of you, just ask the question you want to ask?
Yeah, Sheila, would you like to ask your question?
Good afternoon, sir. This is Sheila from Calcutta. And it's been a very enlightening session. But just like to know your thoughts on, there is, at the end of the day, a huge trust deficit with China. So how do you see that trust deficit affecting the world with its incumbent growth? How do you see it affecting us?
Well, I think, China may have a trust deficit. They understand that. They're also trying to build some bridges. You know, they sent doctors to Italy, and they've been sending a lot of medical supplies all over the world. So China is trying to do its part. They're working very aggressively on the vaccine. They are hoping that it's a Chinese vaccine that goes global. So I think China understands that they've got a image problem, and they're trying to work on that. In the long run, the world needs China, and China needs the world. And it's too important a part of the globe to ignore or write off or cut off. So I think at the end of the day, we'll find a way to work it all out.
Thank you, sir.
Next, Pooja, would you like to come in? Yeah, one last question. Anyone can come in.
Rachna, you can ask. Rachna.
Yes. Okay. So Sushma wants to ask the other half of macroeconomics and the fate of globalization hardcover. Oh, okay. She's written name of the book.
That's the book I told you guys to
read.
To go ahead and read. But even before that book, if you haven't read Poor Charlie's Almanac, I think that should be the #1 book. Okay. And I think in Poor Charlie's Almanac, you know, the last, I think from page 440 to 494, which is the psychology of human misjudgment. You know, that's those 25 psychology of human misjudgment. I think those give you such a huge leg up in life because you start understanding the quirkiness of humans. And I think that those things can give you a big leg up on relationships.
Mohnish, I'm
also
disappointed. I thought you'd recommend the Dhando Investor.
अभी धंधो investor तो सबने पढ़ लिया है ना already, so that's fine. But I would say that like many times when I go to meet Charlie for dinner. In fact, the last time we had dinner was just before the COVID shutdown. I think March 7th was the last time I had dinner with him. I'll be talking about some dysfunctional relative of mine with him, on this, and he's super interested, and I'm telling Charlie, this guy, you're never going to interact with this guy. He's got all these problems. But no, Charlie is very curious about humans. And he doesn't really care about, who these humans are or whatever else. He wants to figure them out, right? And he wants to understand them. And many times I've gone to Charlie with my personal issues and different things. And the way he's able to slice things in terms of understanding how humans work and understanding how life works, it's just amazing. It just gives you a big advantage in life. So I think that that last part of the book where he, which is the talk he gave at Harvard, and then he modified that. I think that talk, I try to read it every year, reread it. And there's so much wisdom and so much, because it took Charlie 50, 60 years to distill that wisdom into that talk. And we can just get that by reading it one shot. So it's a huge advantage.
Mr. Pabrai, I would like to tell my members one thing, that you won a charity lunch with Mr. Buffett. So what takeaway you would like to discuss here on this platform?
Well, that lunch went on for more than 3 hours. And I think we had more than 50 different questions for Mr. Buffett. In fact, he told us that he has nothing going on all afternoon. So whenever we get tired of him, we can tell him to leave and he'll leave. So he didn't even set any time limit. But that was a wonderful lunch, because my daughters at the time were 10 and 12 years old. And so they actually sat on either side of him. And so they actually got a lot of input and direction from him. So it was better for it to come from him than from us. And we covered a lot of topics. And like, for example, he told my daughters that the single most important decision you will make in your lives is who you decide to marry. And I'm glad he was the one who said that, because if I said that, it would just go from one year to the other year. But
I wish he had told me that,
Yeah. To all the young girls, listening this.
Too late. But the thing is, they still remember that. I think they understand what he meant by that. And I think for women, the thing is, on many fronts, they get the shorter straw in life. But I think it makes massive difference who your spouse is.
Are you planning one more lunch on Zoom, Mr. Pabrai, with Mr. Buffett?
Mr. Buffett के अभी lunches बहुत limited रह गए हैं. But I should say this about the Buffett lunch. So after the lunch with Buffett, in the process of setting up the lunch and where we were meeting and all, I got to know his assistant Debbie quite well. Okay, so I told Debbie, I said, hey, listen, Debbie, Guy and I would love to take you out for lunch. Okay. So she said, listen, just come to Omaha one day earlier, like come on to Thursday, and we'll go for lunch. So for a few years, I think for 4 or 5 years, Guy and I would go one day earlier to Omaha and go out with Debbie for lunch. Mm-hmm. And the lunches with Debbie were better than the lunch with Buffett. Okay, way better. Because I used to tell Debbie, I said, look, Debbie, between us girls, can we talk? Can we talk as like close girlfriends? She'll say, yeah, of course, Mohnish, what do you want to know? Okay. So then I would ask him, and of course now we know some of this. I said, does Warren have a cell phone? Okay, so she would say, she started laughing. She'd say, he has a cell phone. It's in my drawer, and he doesn't use it. And when he leaves Omaha, I charge it and give it to him, and he only knows how to call me from that cell phone. So what he does, he opens the phone, he calls me, and then he tells me to tell so-and-so to call him, and then they call him, and that's how he uses the cell phone. Okay, and then I asked, like about, for example, the way he handles his correspondence, right? His mail that comes in and his work habits. It's, just minutia. I wanted to understand how he spends his day and such. So I found lunch with Debbie was way better than lunch with Warren. It was just a lot of fun. And in fact, one time I went to just to share the kind of person Mr. Buffett is. That so one time, Guy and I, we would always go to Berkshire's headquarters. We'd go up to the 14th floor, then we'd meet Debbie, and then we'd go for lunch, right? And so we went up to the 14th floor, and Warren was standing at the elevator to greet us. Okay, and I was really surprised because we had nothing scheduled with him. So he said, listen, Debbie told me you guys were coming. Do you want a tour of the headquarters? So I said, you want to give us a tour? He said, yeah, I got nothing going on. Let's take a tour. Okay. So then we spent like half an hour, 45 minutes going through the whole Berkshire headquarters, and he's going through all the art on the wall. This is the long-term capital letter I sent. This is the first BNSF, stock certificate.
Wow.
This was some arbitrage I was doing with Ben Graham. All this, this memorabilia throughout the office. Then he goes and shows us his Coke fountain where he can get his Cokes and all that. So finally, we were about to go for lunch, and I felt like, maybe the guy has no company for lunch, so maybe he wants to join us, right? So I said, Warren, listen, if you want to come and crash the lunch that we're having with Debbie, you're more than welcome. You don't need to we have no problem having you join us, right? He said, no, they've already brought me my lunch. So he said, Debbie, where's my lunch? She said, it's in the fridge. Okay, so he goes to the fridge, and I kid you not, the strawberry milkshake must be at least 1 feet high. Okay, this huge, big strawberry milkshake, okay? He takes the milkshake, and then he goes to the office and says, this is going to be a great lunch. And then he shut his door. So in many ways, I think my younger daughter, after our lunch with Buffett, I asked her what she thought. She said, he's just a kid. And actually, I think that's the most correct description I've ever heard of Warren Buffett from anyone, because Warren Buffett says he only eats what he used to eat when he was 5 years old. He has not changed any of his, not added a single dish to his repertoire of what he eats. Whatever he ate at 5 years old, he still eats. There are no vegetables that are in the diet. Like his daughter was one asked, does he have any vegetables? She said, is ketchup a vegetable? And so he has no vegetables, and he's 90 and he's in great health. And he's exactly like a kid in all these different ways. And it's like a kid playing the game of Monopoly. That's Warren Buffett.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pabrai. Thank you, Mr. Damani. And I would like to read few messages before I sign off. I would like to share our memories of last year in Omaha. So let's just read the few comments by our members. Brilliant session, amazing takeaways. Can we keep the session going? Most of us, our questions have got answered. Such a fantastic session, oh my God, and so on, it's endless. Thank you so much for being with us today and taking out time from your such a pressing schedule. And Mr. Damani and Mr. Pabrai, and we would like to end on a positive note with our video, a throwback video, which I experienced at Omaha last year. Swati, can we have the video, please? Swati, unmute. Swati, unmute.
I want to really encourage you to do what you're doing. It is fabulous. It is important. And again, not just for the people you touch directly, but again, because that representation matters for all the people who see the effects of your impact. It really makes a difference.
I think financial literacy is much more than just about personal investing. It's actually helps you understand the world a lot better. You, by coming here, by studying principles of Mr. Buffett, you certainly have the passion and the enthusiasm and the belief in what you're doing. And I think, that's more than half the battle. As long as you keep up the faith, stay disciplined, and make sure that, you don't make a lot of hasty decisions, recognizing the markets as one of Mr. Buffett's great quotes. Just remember that the market is not a weighing machine, but is a voting machine. So if you keep that in mind, it will keep you from making a lot of mistakes.
ಇದು ತಗೊಂಡೋಗಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ಫುಲ್ ಪೆಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಡೌನ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ.
Warren, he's Charlie.
Investing is not that easy, because the thing is, yes, we need exceptional managers, and yes, we need great notes, and yes, we need a great price. And finding all those things at the same time is not that easy.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Today's conversation is going to be a game changer for us. And I'm sure we shall incorporate these takeaways and be ever grateful to both of you. Thank you for sharing your honest comments. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being there.
Thank you.
Thank you.